Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, an overview of septic system reinspection programs in Ontario. My name is April Wepler. I'm the engagement coordinator for the Healthy Great Lakes program at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. I will be joined today by panelists Teresa McClenahan, Anastasia Lintner, Terry Reese, and Sarah Minnis. We want to acknowledge the Mott Foundation's support of CELA's Healthy Great Lakes program and their support of today's webinar. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Terry. Go ahead, Terry.
Thanks so much, April, and for everyone for joining us online today. I'm so pleased that so many people are interested in this important topic. I'm going to talk a little bit about our role and about why we're interested and involved, and how we figured into this recent report. And then I'll pass it along to my colleagues who will talk about how their interests fit into this issue about on-site wastewater in rural Ontario. The first thing I wanted to cover was a little bit about who we are and what our role is, what our connection is to on-site wastewater, and then talk a little bit about what we've heard about the state of Ontario's on-site wastewater systems. So that's what I'll cover before I pass it along to Teresa. Federation of Ontario Cottagers, I'm the executive director, by the way. We've got a small office here in Peterborough, Ontario. We've been around since the 1960s, and we represent lake and waterfront property owners across the province. There's about 250,000 people that own waterfront property in the province, and that's who we speak on behalf of and to. And our mission is to support thriving and sustainable waterfronts. And that's both through public advocacy and in encouraging stewardship. Excuse me. It's the next slide. Yeah, so we support people through individual stewardship and helping them to understand their role and their opportunities to make sure their individual actions support sustainable communities, sustainable lakes and rivers. And we're also in support of effective policy. So we'll advocate to government and with partners on policy issues that specifically speak to water quality, but other issues around community sustainability. So that's our role, and we do that on behalf of our 500 member associations that are across Ontario from Kenora to Cornwall. Our interest in wastewater systems stems from the fact that Ontario's got something like 1.2 million septic systems or on-site wastewater systems, and waterfront property owners own about a quarter of them. So we're near water, we have an interest in water, a vested interest in water, and we're also 250,000 wastewater plant operators, if you will. So we have an interest in making sure that these things continue to operate and do what they're meant to do, both for the sake of the community, for the environment, and for our individual families' health and safety. We understand that properly designed, installed, and operated systems can protect public health and the environment, and also that their continued success and doing what they're meant to do relies on their proper operation. We also know that through the work we do with the Clean Water Act, that septic systems, on-site wastewater or sewage works, if you will, are considered a threat and to water, but in the case of the Clean Water Act, septic systems, on-site wastewater systems, I'm sorry, I'll use the words interchangeably, they're deemed as a threat and something whose risk has to be managed. We also know that there's hundreds of thousands of these systems that are outside of drinking water protection zones and aren't covered by the mandatory septic reinspection programs. Next. All right, sorry. So we know, and our opinion is that rural lakes and rivers deserve protection. We know that there's it's a very thoughtful process that went into managing our our municipal systems and managing the risks. But we think that water systems, surface water and groundwater systems in rural Ontario also deserve protection, and that's going to rely on both some policy, supportive policy, leadership and creative approaches across different landscapes and different jurisdictions, but also relies a lot on educating system owners and the community leaders who are responsible to make sure the communities are sustainable. So we have some statistics from our friends at WSP. They're an engineering firm that's done a lot of wastewater systems, and some of this material I'm referring to is contained in a copy of here. And you can find a link to in numerous places, including on our website, and the contact information will be at the end. WSP is an engineering firm that's done several thousands of system inspections, about 650 mandatory inspections in drinking water protection zones, but also over 6,000 systems through discretionary programs. And you can see the statistics there where they've been busy, and particularly in the and we're going to talk a little bit about their experience. And part of what we were trying to do is make sure we shared the learned experience and lived experience of people who have done re-inspections, and hopefully inform future programs that seem to be out there. So the costs is one of the things that they talked about. You know, it's in the $200 range, and that's been in their experience per homeowner. And that's just one of the statistics that Sarah, I think, will touch on a little bit too in her portion. So I'll quickly go through a couple of the statistics that a couple of the things that they learned having looked at thousands of systems, and I'm going to use the statistics from the Algonquin Highlands program that they did. They found all 5 different classes of systems, and the Ontario Building Code considers 5 types of systems. Primarily, we're talking about the Class 4 systems or septic. So they certainly are the majority of the systems that were inspected as part of this Algonquin Highlands program, about 80% of them. But they, of course, came across a number of outhouses or compost and toilet systems, which are Class 1, some gray water leaching pit types systems rather, and some holding tanks that were out there as well. So majority, of course, being Class 4. So these are all well conceived of in the building code. I guess part of our challenge is that upon installation, they're inspected, they're sited properly and installed properly, but we also know the hundreds of systems that are being installed properly every year. We have to realize that there's hundreds of thousands of systems that are installed over the last 80 years and might be in various states of disrepair. So that's why this information we thought was really interesting and useful. So there's a few metal tanks around which are no longer required. This is the kind of statistics that came out of this. And the common code contraventions that they found were some systems that needed to be pumped. And I'll talk about that in a minute. For holding systems, for Class 5 systems, holding tanks, there were alarm or hauling agreement contraventions. In other words, there were no alarm on these systems, which they're required to be, and there was no hauling agreement to ensure they were properly emptied on a regular basis. And for advanced treatment systems, they're required under the building code to have agreements, and a number of them were deficient or missing. The other one code contravention that was commonly cited, or in 30% of the instances, was that some component of the system did not meet the building code setback, so they were sited in the wrong location or too close to water. And of course, as I mentioned, the Class 4 system or septics were the most common things that they came across. So yeah, this is some of the things we found out. There's certainly some steel tanks that are out there. There's some fiberglass. There's some plastic and concrete both being legal and common materials. So the bulk of them being in the current type of material that's considered in the building code. And always some lovely pictures to go along with it, which is helpful to see what we're looking at. Part of learning about all these systems is helping people understand what is under the ground in their own property, and not just for municipal partners or others who are considering the population of systems, but also to help continue the conversation about what in fact is under the ground. So some of the code contraventions that were discovered: Class 1 systems, and there's a lot of outhouses or some version of them across rural Ontario. A number of them didn't meet things about being water tightness or vermin proof, so there was a number of contraventions there. The ones notably in the Class 4 systems, again, the bulk of what we were looking at, about a quarter of them had some sort of some kind of code contravention, and we'll talk about those in a second. So these are the kinds of things that they found. Interestingly, and this is something for anyone who's considering about a program, is the code considers that the systems must be pumped when solids exceed 33% of the tank volume. Only 1 in 6 systems actually required a pump out according to the law and according to the way that these systems are designed. So that's an interesting fact about how pumping fits into a reinspection program, or how pumping should be considered. One of the more interesting statistics, we've got an adjunct interest, all of us, in where all the septic goes. So pumping for the sake of pumping isn't necessarily required, and this kind of data helps to bear that out. The other things that were interesting were the kind of contraventions that I think everyone's concerned about, the cost implications for owners. We think there's a whole other side to this, which is there are some smaller operational or design type of things that can be addressed to ensure systems are going to ensure your household continues to be served by these systems and continue to do their job. And that's things like issues with the beds, the leaching beds, and that's around vegetation on the beds. It's a thing about lids, which is both a safety and a design issue. Something about problems with the leaching beds, and those sometimes are just cracked or broken or plugged pipes. Then, of course, for Class 5 systems, as I mentioned, they're required to have a haulage agreement so that a holding tank is actually pumped when it's required to be pumped. And then, as I said earlier, the vermin-proof nature of Class 1 systems. So, and then, as I mentioned again, 30% of these systems are sited close to water, and our members certainly live near water. So that's just an interesting fact of historical design and installation. Age is often cited as a consideration that people worry about in terms of the failures. These systems are not designed to last forever, and older systems do tend to have more problems. So while the WSP folks found there was quite a number of systems designed which in what would be considered a current sort of design and code and manner in the last 20 years, there are lots that are older than 20 years old. So that's an interesting consideration in terms of what's out there and what's under the ground. Some of the things that the WSP called some fun challenges just were people willing to participate? What were there? What was the constituent consideration, and how did people receive these things? And they found in the town of South Bruce, where they had their thousands of not mandatory re-inspections, discretionary re-inspections, there was only a few people that they couldn't get at for various reasons. Landowners weren't there, had issues getting with them, and only 2 people that were cited as being uncooperative. So they didn't elaborate on that, but they found there was high level of participation. So that was encouraging to know. I think that relies a lot on communications, and that's something I think we'll touch on as well. The other thing that we talked a lot about, Sarah will talk a lot about, what we found in the other case studies, is education is always going to be really core to any of these programs. So it's both about helping people understand why it's important, what other systems work, why it's important to know what's under the ground. Again, about the haulage agreements, and that's a requirement for those holding systems, and an important part of ensuring your household continues to operate as it's supposed to. Things about system design, making sure that baffles in your tanks are in good order, which is typically part of a re-inspection. Effluent filters, which are a new requirement that can be helpful to the ongoing operation and maintenance of your system. And ensuring that you can have access to the system, which is an important thing. So many of these systems are buried and forgotten, and without having access to the lids on these tanks, it's impossible for a homeowner, a pumper, or anyone else to know both where the system is and whether it's what kind of state of repair it's in. So those are the kinds of education pieces the WSP certainly reflected on as important parts of their experience. And then just finally, before I pass it over to Teresa, we heard about a few commonly cited barriers to undertaking these programs. Not knowing where to start or how to do it or what's involved or who might do it. We're all sort of, starting from scratch. And one of the main reasons we undertook this project with our partners was to help people understand there's others have done it, and there's lots of help available. So finding qualified help and how do you fund this reinspection program? There's various models that Sarah will talk about, and helping people understand that it's not impossible. Also helping people understand that with the proper education program and with consultation, that you can overcome some of that ratepayer resistance or suspicion about what the program's all about. And by talking about it openly and with lots of examples, we can get over the fear of the unknown. So these systems are known systems, things that are legitimate parts of the building code and our household operating systems, but we need to all be part of ensuring that they're doing their best for our family, for our households, and in terms of proper wastewater treatment as they're designed and intended. So we're pleased to be part of this, and I think you'll hear more interesting context from the following speakers, and I'll pass it over to Teresa.
Great, thanks, Terry. And just wait for the slides here. Thanks, April. So welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you on the webinar today as well. I echo Terry's comments. The Canadian Environmental Law Association was involved in the project that you're going to hear more about from Sarah for a few reasons, and I'll just give you a bit of background about CELA in that respect. We have core funding from Legal Aid Ontario, as well as other funders. I'll speak in a moment about our Healthy Great Lakes program, and other project funding, as well as a brand new donors program. We have a core mandate to provide access to environmental justice. We represent communities around the province, and we also participate in national cases that are important for Canadian law. And we use and improve laws that protect human health and the environment. And the human health and vulnerable communities aspect of the cases is often a determining factor as to which cases we take. Next slide. And we have two main priorities. One is making sure that people who couldn't otherwise participate in the environmental law system or in decisions that affect them dealing with environmental law have a way to participate in those decisions or to be represented in those decisions, and also advocating for the kind of laws that ensure that sort of opportunity, like the Environmental Bill of Rights and many others. And then our other priority is pollution prevention and working toward public health. And as I mentioned, this is a priority in how we select our cases, but also in how we select our law reform work and our other projects like this one. Next slide. And the Healthy Great Lakes program, which April and Anastasia are part of, I'm proud to say is in its 4th year, funded by the Mott Foundation. And the focus of the Healthy Great Lakes program is to engage a broad suite of people in making a difference around Great Lakes law, affecting its implementation, its development, its use, that aims at protecting and restoring the waters of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Basin, right through the St. Lawrence. And we want to ensure that there's attention paid to about 5 areas of focus that we're working on, and that there's an engaged Great Lakes citizenry making use of the tools available, the legal tools, and holding governments to account. Next slide. So in terms of our work on wastewater policy, CELA's been working on wastewater policy for decades as part of our work on freshwater quality, on groundwater protection, and on drinking water protection. We also work on water quantity issues as well. And we have a long history of commenting on policy dealing with wastewater systems, municipal individual and other scales, and providing responses to summary advice queries on that topic. We also represented the concerned citizens of Walkerton in both phases of the Walkerton inquiry, including, for our purposes today, the phase that dealt with what were the recommendations to protect drinking water in Ontario going forward, and making sure that we wouldn't have a repeat of events like that. And there are many aspects of the recommendations that have been implemented and have been part of our advocacy in terms of ensuring their implementation and that they're working well, like source water protection for municipal water, for example, and the vision of managing water in Ontario on a watershed basis. So we have advocated for that. And we've also participated in many multi-sectoral advisory committees over the years, such as the Nutrient Management Advisory Committee, the committees that advise the province on source water protection, Great Lakes Advisory Committees, Water Takings Advisory Committees, many others. And we have often in the past advocated for adequate funding in a variety of programs for landowners to protect water and for wells and septic education, and we think there's some good models there. In fact, some that could be built up again going forward. But a major outstanding issue that we think hasn't yet been adequately addressed by the Ontario Source Water Protection Program is that, as I mentioned, it's fundamentally focused on municipal drinking water, treated drinking water, with the protection around the intake protection zones and the wellhead protection areas, and the aspects of Justice O'Connor's recommendations around well protection and septics, as well as the vision that was articulated by the multi-sectoral advisory panels in that respect and enabled in the legislation, I should add, has not been acted on yet by the province. And so we have a situation in Ontario where we have many municipalities, towns, villages whose residents are entirely on their own supply for drinking water, as well as on their own management of wastewater through their class 4 septic systems. And there is provision in the Clean Water Act to designate them to have assessment of whether there are threats to drinking water in that area, and if so, to come up with management measures. And we would expect that in that case, in many of those places, one of the things to do would be to provide additional focused outreach, education, and funding programs to help additional owners deal with getting their septics into the best possible shape in order to best protect the drinking water in that area. That remains something that we are continuing to work on and advocating for the inclusion of those communities. So we were very happy to participate in this project, and I will turn it over now to Sarah to take us through the project.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow right now at the University of Saskatchewan. But the research that I'm going to talk about today, I did in summer of 2018 and a little bit after that while I was finishing up my PhD at Memorial University. And that's kind of how I got hooked up with everybody here. Was my dissertation was on Ontario source water protection legislation, policy, and programs, and implications for rural Ontario. So all those things that Teresa was just talking about, and we can have a whole webinar on that and my findings, but definitely something that came out as a very strong risk for source water protection, as well as other water quality concerns in rural areas, was septic system reinspection programs and keeping septic systems maintained. So, as Terry was mentioning, focus members concern of FOCA members. So FOCA, while I was doing this research, came to me and wondered if I would be able to do just a short study kind of outlining some of the municipal reinspection programs and different models in Ontario. We got a little bit of funding from the Rural Policy Learning Commons to do this research. FOCA funded some of this research, and we were able to put together a team that I'll talk about after this slide, who also gave a lot of in-kind support and expertise towards this research. So our main research goal was highlighting promising practices that other municipalities who have reinspection programs, specifically discretionary reinspection programs, which I'll get a little bit into, and rural policy implications of these programs. So our team members were made up of FOCA, of CELA with Teresa. We had the endorsement of the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, and Liz Huff was on our team. We had the Ontario On-Site Wastewater Association, and Anne Egan lent her expertise, and a couple other people from UA. We were able to have Hugh Simpson at the University of Guelph on our team, as well as John Fitzgibbon, who was also doing research around privately serviced areas and source water protection and that kind of thing, and 3 of his grad students, which was really helpful. So we chose 4 case studies, partly because of our own limitations as far as our research budget. We would have liked to do more, but we wanted a diversity. So we did the Township of Rideau Lakes, the Township of Leeds and Thousand Islands, the Municipality of Callander, and the Township of Tiny, and I'll get into specifics about all those case studies in a second. But we wanted to look at different delivery systems to give people a flavor of how people or different municipalities are doing things differently and how it's working or not working for those municipalities with these different programs. So as Terry was mentioning, there's the mandatory programs, official mandatory programs, where within their jurisdiction, they have to do a septic reinspection program according to the Ontario Building Code. And then there's the discretionary programs, which means that the jurisdiction can create a program at the discretion of their program manager. Usually it's something that's instigated by council. So in these discretionary programs, we also wanted to highlight different types of discretionary programs. So those mandatory discretionary programs, which I'll get a little bit more into when I highlight the case studies, and the voluntary discretionary programs. So our first case study was the Township of Leeds and Thousand Islands in Eastern Ontario. So it's both. They have a mandatory program under the Ontario Building Code. They have to, because they're triggered by their local source water protection plan, created under the Clean Water Act, of course, the source protection plans, and they have a discretionary plan. So their discretionary plan is enforced through a bylaw, and it's delivered by the district health unit in their area. They do about 150 to 200 re-inspections per year, and they prioritize these areas with council each year, of which areas are going to be inspected. And owners actually get to choose, just in case for whatever reason they don't want the district health unit to come in and do their re-inspection. They can choose someone from the township or a licensed sewage installer of their choice. And the homeowner pays about $200 for these. Once they're inspected, they get a bill. Our second case study was the municipality of Callander, which is in what I call near North Ontario. I'm actually right by there right now. They're a mandatory program under the Ontario Building Code. So they have to do inspections every 5 years of any systems that are within 120 meters of a water course flowing into Callander Bay. It's delivered by North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority staff. They do everything. And all of the 235 systems that fall within the area that has to be inspected are being inspected within a rolling 5-year period. The homeowner pays $140. So this was interesting because it was actually more when they first started their program, but now that they're in the second round of their inspections, they were able to be more efficient. They were able, now they know where all their systems are, because that was a big part, just asset mapping where all the systems exactly are, was a big part of the beginning of the program. as well as some other just administrative tasks that need to be done with getting the program up and running. But they were able to lower the price quite a bit as far as how much the homeowner pays, which seems to have sat very well with their residents. And every discretionary program that's enforced through their bylaw. So their discretionary program started off as a voluntary program and then turned into a mandatory program because they were finding that they reached that saturation point with their voluntary program. So all the people that were going to volunteer had, and they got to a point where they weren't getting new people, and they did have some strategic concerns about some areas. So they ended up making their program mandatory. Their programs delivered by the Mississippi Rideau Septic System. So the municipality is like a little hands-off, which is was noted as a potential benefit, especially in small towns. So they do around 100 mandatory inspections each year, and they still have the option for people to volunteer for inspections, and they have availability for about 50 of those per year in case residents are really concerned. So they do something a little bit different as far as cost-wise. They don't charge at the time of inspection. They do their program on a cost recovery basis through residential taxes. The Township of Tiny, so they have a mandatory program that they have to do through their local source water protection plan in their designated area, but they also have a really well-established discretionary program. And a lot of the reasons behind this is that a lot of their economy is on their beachfront area, waterfront homes, that type of thing. You can find more about why each of the case studies started their discretionary program specifically in their area in all the case studies. And a lot of the reasons were, water quality, but a lot of the reasons were because their economy of their municipality really relied on either recreation around waterfront or waterfront homes, et cetera, et cetera. So that can be found in the full report. So their mandatory and their discretionary program is enforced through a bylaw, and their program, both the discretionary and the mandatory program, is delivered by a private engineering firm. So, and their discretionary program is mandatory, so that's not voluntary. They prioritized areas each year with council. And they do quite a few per year. So they have quite a shop with CC Tatum and Associates that do the program each year. They do over 1,000 inspections, so it's pretty substantial. With the re-inspections that are discretionary happening every 6 years, and then the mandatory ones are every 5. And they're just under $100 per re-inspection, plus they require you to get your septic tank pump out, which there was a question that pump outs are $75 and $200. I'm not particularly sure. Someone had asked about if there's any regional differences. I'm not sure about that, but maybe one of our speakers at the end can speak a little bit more about that. But something maybe that should be highlighted was, especially in Eastern Ontario, finding qualified help was to either do a reinspection or to get even sometimes septic tank pump outs was noted as a challenge. So part of our research too, so we looked at the case studies, and you can find very detailed case studies within the full report that Terry was talking about, and we'll have some links to that at the end of this. But part of our research also dovetailed nicely with some master research projects coming out of the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. One being Cameron Curran's master's thesis, and I put the link to that in here, and it's at the end of this presentation as well. But he did a jurisdictional scan of other Great Lakes areas and what they were doing for septic system re-inspections to get a flavor of that. So I'll just give you a couple examples so you can see. So in Minnesota, in the United States, since 2004, legislature has required the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to rehabilitate every septic system in the state. And septic systems must be reinspected every 3 years and or at the time of transfer of a property, which is interesting, which is usually common practice if you buy a real property, but sometimes doesn't always happen. And then in Wisconsin, in the United States, they updated their statewide plumbing code in July 2000 to mandate that an inventory and inspection of all private on-site wastewater systems takes place. And their re-inspections are a formal part of the permitting process. So more on that can be found here. There's some overall lessons learned that we found with doing some of our literature scan as well as with our 4 case studies. One being that education is key to a successful program and for getting that buy-in from residents. Part of educational programs, was making appointments, for example, adding an educational aspect to the actual reinspection process. So making appointments with homeowners so they have the availability to be there, to see what's happening, to ask questions of the inspector, that type of thing was noted as important, as well as things like we heard septic socials, where people get together for wine and cheese and learn more about their septic systems. Some lake associations were starting that. Yeah, so so it can be fun things. It can be things. There were some. Also some educational events spearheaded by the public health agencies as well as the CAs, and sometimes a collaboration between the CAs and the public health agencies. As I mentioned before, volunteer programs are unlikely to reach the systems most in need of reinspection. And that's for a variety of reasons. And those people that really don't want their system reinspected, or maybe know that there's a problem and can't afford to pay to fix those problems. Sometimes those people get lost in volunteer programs. And it kind of gets to the third point of residents may fear the cost of needed repairs will be overwhelming. So it's really important with these kind of programs that you identify who are going to be the people against the program. And you look at those barriers and you try to make plans within your municipality to overcome those barriers. Certainly we heard about people on fixed incomes, maybe pensioners, who are fearful that they're going to need a whole new system if something's wrong with their septic system or something comes up during the reinspection. And that's obviously can be a huge cost to somebody on limited means. But as Terry was mentioning, sometimes getting systems into compliance isn't necessarily a whole new system. Sometimes the fixes are actually affordable. But we did hear that loan programs and things like that would be beneficial, even though none of our case study communities were really doing loan programs other than very small ones associated with one of our case study communities. Getting started, as I mentioned with the calendar program, getting started sometimes is a lot, and sometimes you'll spend both time as well as it might be more costly financially at the beginning of your program while you're getting your municipal records straightened out as far as asset mapping where everything is, and getting your administrative details figured out. But it does get better and easier, as we heard. So there will always be some reinspection programs, and other residents opposed identifying those barriers and those people opposed, and why they're opposed is really important, especially when you're designing those educational programs and outreach. Something that was definitely emphasized by all of our case study municipalities was that septic reinspection programs only find failures or deficiencies that already exist. So it's not like it's this witch hunt trying to find things wrong with a system that has nothing wrong with it. It finds deficiencies that need to be fixed that as Terry was mentioning, sometimes with setbacks, that can have real implications on the water that those residents are drinking. If they're on private wells, that can have implications for surface water supplies, and that has implications for recreation and economic development in town. So it's really important, not only for being prudent with your own management of your property and the assets on your own property, and but also for really the sustainability and resilience of rural communities. And also, what we really wanted to emphasize with this webinar was that municipalities considering a reinspection program do not need to reinvent the wheel. We have provided in our final report all sorts of different models, and we've provided all of the bylaws. Our municipalities, their bylaws, their best management practices, the letters that go out to their residents, everything. So if it's a nice little starter package that if you're interested in doing this type of thing, you certainly do not need to start from zero. So hopefully that helps people out. We have our maintenance project website where everything that we have is on there, as well as the FOCO website where the full report is, as well as all sorts of other videos. And certainly you can check out the CELA's website as well, and subscribe for their newsletter for any upcoming webinars like these, as well as other information. And I've just left up also, if anyone has questions and we don't get to it today, feel free to send Terry, Teresa, or myself an email.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
No problem.
You were all very prompt. Everyone ran exactly on time. Thank you. So we're going to we have about 13 minutes left, so we'll do some questions and answers. I'm going to start by reading some of the questions that actually have already been responded to in the Q&A box. While I'm doing that, feel free to pop additional questions into the Q&A box. So our apologies if you're on the phone, you're not going to be able to answer questions. We just don't have the ability to unmute 100 lines and not have the sound really suffer. So if you're on the phone, you're welcome to reach out to our panelists afterwards to ask your questions. But if you are accessing by computer, feel free to pop your questions into that Q&A box. So really briefly, I will read back over the questions that have been answered so that everyone has the benefit of hearing those, and then I'll put some open questions to our panelists. So questions, someone asked, do you have any idea of how many tertiary systems are in the province without an active agreement? And Terry answered and said that that was not part of the data we have access to, but anecdotally, most tertiary systems do not have an active or functioning agreement. There was also a question about whether there is water quality data that supports the assessment that septics represent a significant risk. And the answer there was that the expert panel that CELA was a part of post-Walkerton inquiry identified septic systems as the primary risk to water, especially in the absence of proximate point sources. There was another question that asked, at $92 per inspection, is the program subsidized by a tax increase? And Terry responded that re-inspections are funded in a variety of ways, some through general tax levy, some directly by the homeowner at time of re-inspection, and the report cites a variety of examples. And then a good overall question was, will we have access to the slide deck? And the answer is yes. So most of you should have received the slide deck yesterday, but if you registered after that, we will be circulating it again after the presentation, and we'll also make available the recording from today, so you'll have both. All right, open questions that I'll put to the panelists. What is the current cost range for septic tank pump outs, and does it vary by region? Would anyone like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's between $75 and $200. And I'm not sure if it varies by region. In Eastern Ontario, it's pretty much the same as here, which is where my cottage is, and we're at pretty much the same in kind of near North Ontario.
I might add that one of the partners on the program was, or this research was, the Ontario On-Site Wastewater Association. They've got a map that's available that shows their members, who are all people who are licensed to do hauling. and do servicing on systems. So there's a great resource there for finding someone who does this kind of service. And I think the answer is that it will definitely vary depending on your location and number of other factors. But yeah, it'll depend. But like anything else, you'd have to shop around and find out who's got the best deal.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next question. Is there any insurance company? Oh, hold on. There was a comment in the Q&A about that question. $200 in leads and less on islands, which is more, and it's becoming very difficult to find pumpers. And then also Central Ontario septic pump outs are anywhere from $350 to $500, depending on extent of pump and access. What comments in there on that? Is there any insurance company that insures septic systems other than title insurance?
It's Teresa speaking. I'm not aware of that, and so that would be something that we could ask Sarah if that came up in the case studies at all. Because I assume you're talking about two types of insurance. There's always the issue of the property itself and the elements on the property, structures and other things. But then there's a separate question about liability, third-party liability, off-site liability, that kind of thing. And so that would normally be a question to ask the insurance agent for that particular property, whether that off-site liability from a deficiency in the septic system would be covered by the policy.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and a plug for the fact that we work with an insurance company that covers a lot of rural properties, and that, you know, the answer is always it depends, and you need to read your specific coverage, and that's important for people to do, as Teresa says, for your offsite and sort of external liabilities, but also when it comes to water, the coverages are changing all the time, and that's related a lot to flood and overland flows and things about water getting into your property from various places. So it's always a good idea to make sure you've checked your specific policy and talk to your broker about what kind of coverage you've got for your system, for sure.
And I know that anecdotally, when we're hearing about kind of the sadder stories of people not being able to afford the fixes that were needed, that the insurance company was not going to cover the fixes that were needed or a whole new system. So I don't know if that's always the case, but we did hear that as, you know, one of those barriers or concerns.
Yeah, they would likely consider that maintenance, which is not the kind of thing that's normally covered by an insurance policy. Mm-hmm.
Right.
I would say from a risk management perspective, maintaining your system is a good way to ensure you don't have a problem long term, and that's whether you've got financial coverage through a policy or not. You know, I think the main message from this whole thing is that insuring yourself against a failed system is a good investment. So if it costs a few hundreds of dollars to keep a system that's an expensive and important household system going for 10 or 20 more years, that's, you know, you can do the math yourselves, but that's good insurance.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So another question in the Q&A box, we have had questions related to what can legally be undertaken under the Ontario Building Code as part of a discretionary inspection, i.e. it isn't clear what legally property owners can be compelled to open their tank unless deemed unsafe. Do you have any legal guidance on interpretation of the OBC that will be presented today or could be made available?
So CELA will have to take that back to see if we can dig into that a little bit on a summary advice basis and then make a brief answer available. And obviously, as we already alluded to, if it's something that's been designated a potential threat or hazard under the Clean Water Act, and it's been included as the kinds of measures that are responsive to those threats, then that can be made binding. That's clear, because the Clean Water Act, part of the point of it was to add a number of new tools for municipalities and conservation authorities and others protecting municipal drinking water to be able to take action that when previously it wasn't as clear cut that they could. But in the case of this scenario, we'll have to take that back.
So the next question here is there a standard as to how the inspection is being conducted, such as are the tanks looked at before and after a pump out? And conveniently, someone in the audience weighed in and commented that we use the ministry guideline that was issued at the beginning of the program. I'd be more than happy to share a copy. Would any panelists like to add to that?
Yeah, and that guideline to have in and on our website.
Can you just say that again, Sarah? Your sound was a little delayed at the beginning of your answer. That's okay.
Rural internet, folks. That's another webinar on broadband. But yeah, we do have that ministry guideline to attach to the calendar case study, I believe. It's in our great documents.
Okay, thank you. Of all the inspection approaches, do you have a recommended model, and what is their inspection procedure? So that might go along with your previous answer.
I mean, certainly, as I said from the beginning of my talk, I'm not a septic reinspection expert or technical expert, but we do provide some basic information on how they did each inspection program, whether it's visual, what they check for, that kind of thing. I would just reiterate that it should be on the needs of your community and it should place what you're doing. And Terry, did you have something else to add to that?
Well, as we like to say, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community.
Yeah.
So Part 8 of the building code, which is done, which is where septic or on-site wastewater is considered, is done. The principal authority is different in every jurisdiction. There's conservation authorities, there's the chief building officials, there's public health, there's private contractors, and depending on the lay of your land, the economics in your neighborhood, and what resources you have available locally, any or all of those models can work. And I think it wasn't, we never came up with the magic answer because I think there maybe isn't one single response or one single answer to how they're done.
Okay. So I'm going to read two comments that were put in the Q&A box that I think relate to those last couple questions, and then I think we can squeeze in one more question before 2 o'clock. So the two comments that were added here were the recent addition of the, and I apologize, I don't know this acronym, CANBNQ standard into the OBC requires all tertiary systems installed since January of 2017 are tested regularly for their ongoing functionality, and homeowners are provided a maintenance agreement with the system. Okay, and then the last question that I see here that's still open is, has there been any follow-up to see how these municipalities have dealt with non-compliance of any required action items after the inspection if required?
Yeah, so each of the case studies outline what happens when someone doesn't either want to comply with allowing someone on their property to perform the reinspection, or if they are unable or do not want to comply with the findings of the report and needed changes to the system or to get it into compliance. Everyone did it differently. Certainly a challenge noted by the municipalities who were doing the discretionary program was how far they wanted to push things. You know, how much of their human resources and financial resources they can have tied up in litigation, and that those types of moves forward if someone really doesn't want to comply. But there were stories certainly of OPP escorts to do the actual reinspection and those types of things. So.
Okay. All right, well, we are just about at 2 o'clock, and I think we've answered all the outstanding questions here. So as I said, we will share the slide deck, a link to the recording, and we can also capture some of the Q&A into a written document so that if you were on the phone and not able to see the chatter that was going back and forth in the Q&A, you'll have access to that as well. So thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined us. We are at 114 participants, lots of interest in septics. That's great. Thank you all for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.